All right. So the first symposium of this BCCD began with Gil Diesendruck warning us about parochial thinking as one of the most pressing challenges we are facing today. Now, as we are approaching the end of this BCCD, I would like to share some of my own work on the development of a potential antidote to parochial reasoning, namely intellectual humility. So what I will do in the next 15 minutes is I will tell you what intellectual humility is and why it's important and how we decided to measure it. And then I will share data from 3 different countries with you that reveal similarities and differences of how intellectual humility develops. I would not be possible to do this work alone, so I'm very lucky to collaborate with Samuel Ronford. He's from the University of Toronto, and with Azzurra Ruggeri. She's a professor at the Central European University in Vienna and the Technical University in Munich. And I also want to thank my colleagues from the iSearch lab for supporting me before this talk. Okay, so intellectual humility can be defined as the ability to recognize the limits of your knowledge and the ability to openly consider others' perspective. Interestingly and importantly, individuals with higher intellectual humility are not only more open to revise their beliefs, but they are also more engaged in learning what is true and invest more effort to correct misunderstandings. So this is important because they do not just arbitrarily change their beliefs, but they are motivated to seek truth. But most research on intellectual humility has focused on adults from weird populations, which leaves open the questions how intellectual humility develops across different cultures. And developmental research has investigated cognitive processes that are relevant for intellectual humility, like evaluating different sources of information, or knowledge monitoring, or belief revision. But these measures weren't explicitly designed to study intellectual humility as an integrated construct. And as a result, we still know relatively little about how these processes come together to form intellectual humility in children. So we address this gap by developing a new intellectual humility framework, which consists of the following components. Evaluation. This describes the ability to differentiate between different sources. Awareness, which is the ability to spot gaps in your own knowledge. And revision, which captures the ability to critically decide when it's worth changing or maintaining your prior beliefs. Each of these components of this framework was tested using separate behavioral measures so that every child participated in 3 experimental blocks consisting of multiple measures, and we counterbalanced the block order and the stimuli between participants. We had 3 samples. First, a Canadian sample of 4 to 8-year-olds. They were tested online during COVID, and we tested 135 participants. Then a German sample with 105 participants between 6 and 11. They were tested in schools and in the lab. And an Indian sample with 226 participants between 8 and 11. They were recruited through the JPAL network and tested in schools in rural India. So you may notice that there is not a perfect age overlap, and this has to do with how the data were collected. They were collected in different projects, so the Canadian data came from a standalone study, and the German and the Indian data were part of a larger study on active learning in children. But the tasks and the procedures were exactly the same across all samples, which allows us to compare the data meaningfully. And I also assume that you're all familiar with online testing and with testing in the lab, but maybe testing in rural India is a little bit different from your everyday work experience. So in India, children were tested by an experimenter, by trained experimenters in quiet rooms at local schools, and they received a little prize for participating. And up to 4 children were tested at the same time, each in a separate corner of a school facility room. Children were either sitting at desks or on the floor, depending on what the facilities provided. And the instructions were translated into the local language of that region by bilingual translators. Okay, so let's begin with the evaluation block, which investigated how children differentiate between different sources. So to make this as fun, as engaging as possible, we presented children with those monsters, and then we told them that the monsters really love fruit, and they are particularly into oranges. Then the monsters disappeared, and the children saw how we hid an orange in each of the boxes. And then each monster got one of the boxes, and we had a little comprehension check, so we asked the children whether they know what's inside the box, and then we also asked them whether the monsters know what is inside the box, and children should say that they know themselves what is inside the box and that the monsters don't know what's inside the box. And then we crossed two variables, which is visual access to the box's content and expressed knowledge about it. Okay, so for example, first the yellow monster looked inside the box and said, I know what's inside. The green monster did not look inside the box, but still said, I know what's inside. Then the red monster looked inside the box and said, I don't know what's inside. And the blue monster did not look inside the box and said, I don't know what's inside. So by crossing these two factors, we created 4 types of monsters. The yellow monster had access and claimed knowledge, so we refer to it as the knowledgeable monster. The blue monster didn't have visual access to the box's content and also admitted that, so we refer to it as the intellectually humble monster. And the other 2 monsters reflect inaccurate and false claims. Children then entered 4 forced choice tasks, in which we always contrasted the knowledgeable or the intellectually humble monster with one of the other monsters. So we told them, here is a sticker, and you can decide who did a greater job and should get the sticker. Would you like to give it to the yellow monster or to the green monster? And in a similar way, we contrasted the unknowledgeable and the intellectually humble monster, the knowledgeable and the unknowledgeable monster, and the false claiming and the intellectually humble monster. Now, to interpret children's decisions, we created a score where we awarded children with 1 point every time they gave a sticker to either the intellectually humble or the knowledgeable monster. So over the 4 rounds, they could achieve a maximum score of 4 and a minimum score of 0. The y-axis of this graph will show the percentage of children who either got 1, 2, 3, or 4 points. There were no children who got 0 points. And the colors of the stacked bars will indicate how many points children got. And then the x-axis of this graph is going to show children's age and the country where they were tested. So for younger children, we found age improvements. And then starting from around the age of 8, across all cultures, children consistently, or like over the majority of children, scores 3 and 4 points. And that means that they prefer the knowledgeable or intellectually humble informants over ignorant and false claiming ones. So evaluating the quality of different sources is obviously central to intellectual humility, but so is also the ability to calibrate your own knowledge. And we measured this in the awareness block. Here we presented children with either complete or incomplete information. And then we asked them to rate how sure they were to know the answer to a question on a 4-point Likert scale, from very sure to very unsure. In the complete information trial, which you can see on the left, we gave them all the necessary information to answer a question. So for example, we asked, which of the monsters is going to a birthday party? And it was clearly visible that the monster on the top left is going to a birthday party because it's wearing the birthday hat and a little gift. And in incomplete information trials, the relevant information for answering a question was not present. So for example, we asked which of the monsters is sad, and there were no clear features of sadness. So this graph will show children's confidence ratings on the Likert scale from very sure to very unsure, and their age in months on the x-axis. The line type will indicate what kind of information was presented. So the solid line indicates the complete information trials, and the dotted line indicates the incomplete information trials. And the different colors are indicating the different countries where children were from. Okay. So Canadian children clearly distinguished between complete and incomplete information trials, but they were also overly optimistic to know the answer in the incomplete information trials. And surprisingly, their confidence increased with age for incomplete information trials, which is a decline in calibration accuracy. German children here in orange showed similarly strong differentiation between complete and incomplete information. They were still overly confident to know the answers, but with age their confidence ratings became more accurate. And Indian children here in green were overall less confident in the complete information trials and more overconfident than the other two samples in the incomplete information trials. But with age, their confidence ratings for the incomplete information trials became more accurate. Now, awareness of one's own knowledge states is also a central part of intellectual humility, but equally important is the ability to revise your beliefs when you are presented with convincing counter-evidence. And this is what we tested in the revision block. So here we presented children with 3 types of evidence: plausible, implausible, and new. And we were interested in whether or not they would change their initial decisions based on the quality of the evidence provided. So here is an example that's going to illustrate this. In the plausible evidence trials, we told children that there is a monster who has got a rabbit, but it's not sure what to feed the rabbit, a carrot or some hay. Now suppose the child selected the carrot, and then the rabbit always indicated that it wanted the opposite of what the child first said. So in our case, it said that it wanted to eat some hay. And now the rabbit was still hungry, and we asked the children to make a second choice, what to feed it, some hay or a carrot. And we predicted that children would change their initial answer when asked to feed the rabbit again, because the provided evidence was reasonable. On the contrary, in the implausible evidence trial, children were again presented with a friendly monster with a pet, and it doesn't know what to feed it, a coin or a bone. Almost all children selected a bone. And then the dog indicated that it preferred to eat the implausible option, so the coin. And then the dog was still hungry, so we asked the child what to feed it. And here we predicted that children should maintain their initial answer, so the bone, because the provided evidence is not plausible. In the new evidence trials, we presented children with a similar situation as in the plausible trials, but they shouldn't have any priors, or we wanted them not to have any priors, so we had this idea of like an alien pet that they were presented with. So similar logic, what do you think the pet wants to eat? Suppose they choose the mushroom, and then the pet says that it wants to eat the opposite, the leaf. It's still hungry, what should we feed it? Okay, now we predicted that they should change their initial answer because the provided evidence is reasonable. Okay, so then to analyze children's behavior, we created a score. Children received 1 point if they changed their initial answer in the new and plausible evidence trials. So for example, when the rabbit says it wants to eat some hay, right? And they received 1 point if they maintained their initial answer in the implausible trials. So, for example, when the dog said it wanted to eat a coin. So, in this graph, the y-axis will be showing whether or not children scored a point as predicted. And the evidence type will be differentiated by different line types, and the countries children are from will again be in the same colors as in the plot before. So, here's what we find. In both Western samples, children show age improvements for plausible and new evidence trials. But then with implausible evidence, their accuracy decreases with age, or at least doesn't improve. And for Indian children, it's the other way around. So they performed best in the implausible trials, while their performance in the new and plausible trials got worse over time, or with age. Okay, so let me try to summarize this. I think we can categorize children's behavior, or the data that we found, into 3 categories, namely stability, development, and variation across cultures. So across all countries, we found that by the age of 8, children preferred intellectually humble and knowledgeable informants or monsters in the evaluation block, and we found that they tend to be overly optimistic about their knowledge states when provided with incomplete information in the awareness trials. Until 8, children increasingly become more, so they get more likely to prefer the knowledgeable and intellectually humble monsters in the evaluation block. And with age, their performance in the awareness blocks for children in Germany and India improves. Then the age-related changes in the revision block varied by culture, and in particular here we found that the revision block showed the strongest cultural variation, with German and Canadian children performing best in the plausible and new evidence trials and worse in the implausible trials, and for the Indian children it was the other way around. Okay, so I'm out of time, but before I finish, I'd like to mention that I've only shown you part of the picture today, because I focused on tasks that children performed alone. And now one of you could argue that intellectual humility mainly shows itself in social interaction. So I want to say that we also implemented a measure that measured intellectual humility in social situations, and I'm happy to talk about that if this is something that interests you. Thank you.